What happens after a regime changes? You've probably seen the playbook, and on paper it sounds simple. Take a country with an unstable and oppressive leader, remove them, and replace them with one who aligns with your, usually American, interests. Then, all is well. The only real issue, it never works. In 2001 it was Afghanistan, 2003 Iraq, Libya 2011, and now it seems Iran. But this time it's different, because Iran isn't like any of the other countries on the list before. It has the world's third largest oil reserves, and the centerpiece to a network of alliances across the region. Topple this, and what follows isn't just another failed state. You pull the thread that holds together an entire region, creating a power vacuum that stretches from Lebanon to Yemen, the Strait of Hormuz, and possibly every gas station on the planet. Here is the pattern of regime change, and why toppling Iran's leadership may just be the start of America's problems. In the 80 years since the Second World War, the United States has spent 60 years, nearly 3/4 of that time, involved in some kind of war. These conflicts have spanned every corner of the globe and cost trillions of dollars. In the 1960s, the war in Vietnam was a way to stop communism. In the early 2000s, Iraq was invaded to stop the creation of weapons of mass destruction, and in 2011, the same was done to Libya and Colonel Gaddafi. The logic behind all of them was the same. If you spread democracy, the world gets more stable, and a more stable world means a safer and richer America. Now, America is hardly the first country to run this playbook. The British Empire redrew maps across the Middle East. The Soviet Union installed puppet states across Eastern Europe, and even Napoleon tried to set up governments in Europe. It's arguably the oldest move in the Great Power playbook. But given how common these interventions have been throughout history, you might expect that they, actually work. In reality, the opposite is true. Of the 28 times that the US has tried regime change, only 3 have been successful: Japan, Germany, and Panama. So the obvious question is, why? Why does this keep failing? And why would it just fail again in Iran? The answer isn't really about military strategy or political will. It's about something much more fundamental: how money flows through a country. In most of the Western world, economic power is highly decentralized. In a country like the UK or the US, the economy works from the bottom up. Millions of people and businesses produce things, earn money, and get taxed on it. And that tax is what funds everything: roads, hospitals, the military, all of it. Which means the government is effectively dependent on its people. If the people stop producing, the state has no money. And that dependency is what keeps the whole thing in check. Now, flip everything I just said on its head. In a country like Iraq, the government doesn't need its people to generate wealth. Instead, it's sitting on a valuable resource: oil. It can pull money straight up out of the ground and into government accounts, which means this whole power dynamic reverses. The people don't fund the state funds the people. This may seem like quite a small distinction, but it literally changes everything. And this really becomes an issue as you tend to skip a few steps on the development chain. Just take a look at what happened in Iraq. Before the 2003 invasion, oil accounted for roughly 95% of Iraq's export revenue and around 60 to 70% of GDP. This oil sector was entirely state-controlled, meaning that literally everything in the country, public sector wages, food rations, fuel subsidies, and infrastructure spending, all flowed outward from a centralized system financed by oil. Even in the private sector, which didn't seem linked to oil, all relied upon it. Funnily enough, this term was a phenomenon coined in the 1970s by an Iranian economist, Hossein Mahdavi, something which he called a rentier state. In a rentier state, the deal is that the government controls the wealth, and in exchange for political obedience, it distributes enough of that wealth to keep people compliant. It's a social contract, just not a very democratic one. And as long as that deal holds, it can work. For example, Saudi Arabia has run on this exact model for decades and remained remarkably stable. The problem only really starts when that deal begins to break, when someone, whether it's an invading army or an internal collapse, removes the distributor. That's when everything unravels. So when the United States removed Saddam Hussein in 2003, they didn't just need to replace the leader, but the entire way the economy functioned. Okay, this sent things up the wall for really 3 main reasons. In Western democracies, people tend to make a lot of fuss when the government changes, but in the grand scheme of things, day-to-day life for most people tends to look the same, whether it's under a Labour government or a Conservative one. Now, part of that is cultural. Western people are just much more used to political power moving from leader to leader. But much more importantly, in developed economies, the government isn't the only thing that keeps an economy running. However, in a rentier state, removing the government is like pulling the final piece of the Jenga tower. Everything above it simply collapses with it. The playbook for regime change was designed with Western-style economies in mind. Swap the leader, keep the institutions, and let the system carry on. But in a rentier state, the leader is the system. In 2003, the head of the Coalition Provisional Authority, Paul Bremer, looked at a fallen Iraq and saw a problem. Hundreds of thousands of armed, trained men who had served under Saddam and who could at any moment rise up and challenge the new order. So he did at the time what seemed like the logical thing to do. He dissolved the Iraqi military entirely and banned senior members of Saddam's Ba'ath Party from holding public office. What followed next, however, was a catastrophe. Overnight, around 300,000 soldiers were put out of work, men with military training, access to weapons, and now absolutely no income, no pension, and no stake in whatever came next. The one institution that could have provided some continuity was deliberately dismantled. And those men didn't just disappear. They went looking for whoever would pay them. Many of them ended up forming the backbone of the very insurgencies the US would spend the next decade trying to fight. And this leads us to the second reason as to why regime change usually fails. When the distribution mechanism breaks, it doesn't just leave a vacuum. It leaves the greatest prize of all for those willing to steal it: keys to the state. And by definition, everything that runs the country. While many of these countries, Libya, Iran, Iraq, may be on paper rich, the vast majority of the population are not. At the time of the invasion, average incomes in Iraq were around $12,000 a year, but in reality, around 40% of the country were living in extreme poverty, earning less than $2.15 a day. So when a foreign country comes along and kicks out the regime, it presents a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for different political factions to seize power, and more importantly, money. The critical resources, oil facilities, military stockpiles, and government mineral reserves are all finite, so different factions end up using ever increasingly brutal methods to try and secure them. It's a dynamic we've seen play out time and time again. For example, countries most dependent on Moscow's centralized distribution, the Central Asian republics and parts of the Caucasus, saw exactly this. When the Soviet Union collapsed, former party officials and criminal networks carved up state assets almost overnight, and in Tajikistan, it spiraled into outright civil war. And within months of the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the group which would become Al-Qaeda began coordinating bombings and assassinations across the country. All sorts of groups began cropping up, attempting to do the same thing: fill the power vacuum left by the old regime, and secure the wealth and influence that would come with it. But here's the really crucial part. Imagine a bar fight. The person left standing at the end isn't the one trying to keep things civil. It's the one willing to do whatever it takes. And we see this pattern play out in countries too. When these resource-dependent nations begin to collapse, it brings everything down with it, even the most basic legal protections. And that creates a world where the most violent and extreme groups, historically suppressed by the regime, are free to operate without constraints. If you're an ordinary person living through that, it doesn't really matter whether you agree with them or not. They control your neighborhood, they have the guns, and they're the ones keeping the lights on. So you go along with whoever can protect you. And that's really the trap. Removing a dictator sounds like it should make things better, but when the entire economy runs through that regime, taking it out just leaves people at the mercy of whoever fills the gap, and those people tend to be a lot worse. So, if this is a structural problem, the obvious next question is, can't you just power through it with enough time and money? The claim goes something like this: if the US had just stayed in Iraq, Afghanistan, or Vietnam for a couple decades longer, regime change might have just worked. Then, given time, democratic institutions would be able to take root, putting the country on the path towards development. There is some logic to that view. In the two most obvious success stories, Germany and Japan, the United States not only provided them with unprecedented amounts of aid funding, but also maintained a large military presence for decades. But while that undoubtedly played a role in transforming the countries into where they are today, it misdiagnoses why Germany and Japan actually worked, for two simple reasons. Firstly, before destruction, both countries had deep institutional foundations, functioning bureaucracies, legal traditions, educated workforces, and industrial capacity going back generations. America wasn't simply constructing a state from scratch. It was helping reconstruct one that already had the underlying architecture. Compare that to Iraq or Afghanistan, where those foundations either didn't exist or were completely entangled with the regime. And secondly, but maybe more importantly, Germany sat on the doorstep of the USSR, and Japan bordered China and the Soviet Far East. American presence, even if not warmly welcomed, was broadly accepted as a guarantee against invasion. That gave the population a reason to tolerate occupation and cooperate with the new order. However, in most modern cases we see, that external threat simply doesn't exist, and without a common enemy for the population to unite against, the foreign power becomes the enemy. Afghanistan is the perfect example. The United States stayed for nearly 20 years, and at its peak more than 100,000 American troops were deployed, and trillions of dollars were spent in an attempt to build up the country. But it literally took days after they left for the Taliban to regain control. Why? In place of no shared enemy to unite against, the US became the enemy. Over the years, countless civilians were killed, and over time, even Afghans who opposed the Taliban grew enormously resentful of the United States. Incidentally, this quickly became one of the Taliban's strongest recruiting tools. They didn't need to be widely loved, they only needed to present themselves as the force willing to end foreign military presence. So, in a cruel twist of fate, the presence of America ended up strengthening the very forces it was trying to break. So, by now, the pattern should be pretty clear. A resource-rich state gets toppled, the economy collapses overnight, armed factions fight over what's left, and the most extreme group tends to win. And the longer a foreign military stays, the more it becomes the enemy. Every country on that list, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, all followed some version of this script. But here's what makes the current moment so different. Because now the country at the centre of this conversation isn't some small isolated state, it's Iran. This is a country of 90 million people, sitting on the world's third largest oil reserves, and it's already been through some version of this regime change. In 1953, Iran had a somewhat dubiously democratically elected prime minister. He had just nationalised Iran's oil and taken it back from the British. So naturally, the CIA and MI6 organised a coup and removed him, and instead installed the Shah. For 25 years, it looked like it worked. But in 1979, that resentment exploded. The Islamic Revolution swept the Shah from power, and the new regime was designed from the ground up to never be toppled by the West again. And this is the real key difference, because unlike Saddam's Iraq or Gaddafi's Libya, this isn't a regime built around one man. It's built around layers: military, religious, economic, institutions that have spent over 40 years surviving under pressure, so there's no single point of failure. The US and Israel clearly understood this, which is why they didn't just target one man, they hit multiple leadership nodes at once. But here's why this still doesn't solve the problem. Iran isn't isolated either. It sits at the centre of a network of proxy forces, stretching from Lebanon to Yemen. So, on paper, the argument for regime change sounds compelling. Remove a hostile government, disrupt the proxy network, prevent nuclear breakout, and replace the whole thing with something more moderate. But if everything we've just covered tells us anything, it's what sounds good on paper and what actually happens are two very different things. Okay, so there are about a million different possibilities of what could happen if the US replaces Iran's leader, but they roughly fall into four main buckets. The first, and probably most likely, is the regime gets replaced with some sort of oil oligarchy. The current regime collapses either through military defeat or internal fragmentation. A replacement leadership quickly consolidates power, perhaps a restored pre-1979 constitutional framework, or perhaps a genuinely democratic system that emerges from within Iran itself. On paper, this is the best case scenario, and it's not entirely implausible. Surveys suggest that somewhere around 70 to 80% of Iranians would vote against the Islamic Republic if given the chance. And after the Women, Life, Freedom protests in 2022, support for outright regime change spiked. So the desire for change is clearly there, but that's where this theory starts to come undone. To see why, it helps to look at a country that's already been through something similar. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and the ideology that held the system together for decades, communism, was gone. What followed next under Yeltsin was exactly the kind of chaos you'd expect. Economic freefall, oligarchs carving up state assets, and a government that could barely function. But the old system didn't actually die. It just changed clothes. While the vast majority were fighting over ideologies, those who held the real power before, the security services, the ex-KGB, were all quietly behind the scenes scooping up the real keys to power: oil, gas, minerals. So by the time Vladimir Putin stepped into selling a vision of order, the institutions that put him there didn't just disappear after communism fell, but just rebranded. It's not hard to imagine a similar situation in Iran. In Iran, the state owns the largest companies across the extraction, manufacturing, and finance. And that power is split between two pillars. On the one side, you've got the religious authority, so the supreme leader, the clerical establishment, and organizations called bonyads, which are religious foundations that receive around 30% of central government spending, operating with almost no public oversight. On the other side, you've got the security apparatus, the IRGC, known as the Revolutionary Guard, who over decades have quietly built their own economic empire across construction, energy, telecoms, and even smuggling networks. And all of this is ultimately powered by the same thing: oil and gas, which accounts for the majority of government income. So you can see how the picture starts to shift. It doesn't matter that millions of people want change, because the people closest to the oil fields, the export terminals, the banks, the state enterprises, are not protesters, but instead the forces behind those two pillars, and they're not going to hand over that power just because someone held a vote. Okay, this is still kind of a best case scenario, which isn't actually that different from what we have now. But if we've learnt anything from history, it's not normally the moderates who take control. And that leads us to the second and far more realistic outcome. The regime change of Iran doesn't produce a clean transition, but total chaos. Something the US will be very familiar with. Right now, Iran is home to a network of radical groups. Hezbollah, the Houthis, Hamas, to name a few. But at least for now, they exist within a strict hierarchy, with Tehran sitting at the top. The Islamic regime has shown plenty of times that it's willing to use the most extreme methods, but it also has a country to run, and that simple fact forces a little degree of restraint, and if nothing else, they can't afford to be completely cut off from the rest of the world. But if we remove that central state, the force keeping those rebel groups in line disappears with it. Suddenly, you have thousands of militants who are highly trained, heavily armed, and battle-hardened, and they no longer have a political boss telling them when to hold back. Without that, many of these groups would radicalize even further. Remember, it was only a matter of years after Al-Qaeda was formed in Iraq that it effectively filled the vacuum left after the US invasion. And the groups we're talking about here, the remnants of Kataib Hezbollah and the Badr organization, are in many ways better organized, better armed than anything that had existed in Iraq at that point. Now, according to the IDF, Hezbollah alone is estimated to have stockpiled over 150,000 rockets and missiles, more than most standing armies in the region. What you have to remember is that Al-Qaeda, for all the chaos it caused, was building pipe bombs in backrooms. These groups, on the other hand, have been state-sponsored for decades, and add to all of that the rogue factions that would end up simply selling their services to the highest bidder. We've already seen how that works. Wagner Group veterans flooding into African conflict zones, former Taliban commanders brokering arms deals across Central Asia. Iran's fractured militias would be no different. Whether it's Gulf states buying influence, international arms traffickers moving hardware across porous borders, or cartel networks looking for security muscle, the market for that kind of expertise doesn't just simply disappear when a regime fails. Of course, all of this internal chaos would spread quickly along two main fault lines. Firstly, Iran isn't a monolithic Persian state. Only about half of the population is actually Persian. The rest, Azeris, Kurds, Arabs, Baluchis, have all been held together by the central government for decades. Remove that, and those fault lines crack open fast. Kurds in the northwest would push for autonomy, dragging Turkey in. The Azeris in the north might look towards Azerbaijan, and most critically, Iran's Arab minority in the southwest sits right on top of the country's most important oil infrastructure. And if that region gets contested, it's not just a political crisis anymore, it's a global energy one. Iran is immensely important for the global economy, controlling the Strait of Hormuz and holding the third largest oil reserves in the world. And that gives any country in the region the excuse or the justification they've been waiting for to get involved. and it doesn't seem like too much of a stretch to imagine Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, even Turkey getting involved. And in the vacuum of a collapsing regime, such an outcome becomes more and more likely, particularly as rogue factions scramble for control. Instead of a new Iran, you'd end up with a proxy war on steroids, a 1,000-mile strip of territory where nobody is in charge. What all of this produces, ultimately, is people trying to leave. To the west, millions would surge through Turkey toward the European Union, and to the east, pressure would pour into Pakistan and Central Asia, countries that can barely hold themselves together on a good day. Of course, the US and the rest of the Western world will be desperate to avoid this outcome. The most obvious way to do this would be to maintain a heavy foreign presence in the region and attempt to install, or at least strongly back, a friendly replacement government in Iran, a bit like what's going on in Venezuela at the moment. And it wouldn't be the first time that this has been tried. In 1953, a CIA and UK-backed operation undemocratically removed Iran's standing prime minister, replacing him with a Shah, effectively chosen by the West to represent their interests. And for a while it worked. But the world in 1953 looked very different. Back then, the US and the UK were the dominant external players, and nobody else was actively working against the installation. Tehran modernized rapidly, earning the nickname the Paris of the Middle East, and Iran began to look less like an Islamic state and more like a genuine Western ally. But of course, that alignment came at a cost. Over the years, the Shah became increasingly associated with foreign interference, and opposition movements, secular and religious alike, fused around a single idea, that Iran's sovereignty had been sold. By 1979, that resentment turned into a full-blown revolution. The Shah was gone, and in his place came something far more extreme than anything that had existed before. And there isn't much reason to believe that an attempt to do the same today would go any different. Today, Iran is embedded in the strategic interests of both Russia and China. Russia has deepened its military ties significantly. Drone transfers, fighter jet deals, intelligence sharing, and views Iran as a key partner in its broader confrontation with the West. China, on the other hand, imports massive quantities of Iranian oil and has its own infrastructure ambitions across the region, with significant Belt and Road projects in the area. Neither power would just sit back and watch a US-aligned government take control of the world's third largest oil reserves. At minimum, you'd see money and weapons flowing to opposition factions, and at maximum, full proxy operations designed to make sure any Western-backed government never stabilizes. The reality is that none of the options facing the US at this point in time are particularly appealing. The regime was brutal and extremely dangerous, and the pressure to act was completely understandable. But if history has taught us anything, it's that the question was never whether the Islamic Republic is bad, it's whether whatever comes next would be any better. And based on every example we have, the honest answer is probably not. There's also a deeper problem that rarely gets discussed. This kind of intervention sends a very clear message to every other hostile regime watching from the sidelines. If you don't have nuclear weapons, you're at risk of getting kicked out. Gaddafi gave up his and ended up dead. Saddam had none and was toppled within weeks. But the regimes that have them, North Korea being the most obvious example, have been largely untouchable ever since. If the US continues intervening in foreign regimes, it will only encourage other rogue states to go nuclear as fast as possible, just to make sure they're never next on the list. The reality is that the cost of getting this wrong goes far beyond just another failed state. It would create a far more dangerous world, with more nuclear ambitions, and a region that could take generations to recover.